Ah, well, what a nice day. It's early June, it's sunny, there's a nice temperature, we are getting closer to summer, so what better way to talk about getting taken for a dirt nap, sleeping with the fishes, returning to the source, kicking the bucket, become a living challenged person. As to say, death, what a nice argument to have for today. So I wanted to make a video about Castonatria as a raid, because it's been out for 6 months, it's time to draw our conclusions about this raid before the next tier. I was looking for some comparisons with Uldir, Battle of the Zavalor, Eternal Palace, Nyalotha, what changed, looking at some of the numbers for tanks and healers and DPS and whatnot, even the participation of the guilds, etc, etc. But first, I figured out to go over something more interesting and also something that doesn't really get talked a lot, which is how many times are you going to die in a raid? How many times are you going to cause your raid and your guild to wipe and also to hate you? What is the chance for each of the specs to die? Are you more likely to die if you play a certain spec or not? Maybe is it because of the mobility? Maybe is it that classes with immunities die less? Could this be a way to categorize an entire group of people into a stereotype as the clowns, the unskilled clowns playing a class, just like it happened for many years to hunters, for example? Pretty sure red paladins are suffering the same discrimination against them. I would say it's well warranted, but that's another point. So what we're looking at today is death. How much do you die? How often do you die? Depending on what you are playing. Now let's start first with tanks. Now you would be saying, okay, tanks die a lot because they are the ones who get slapped a lot by the bosses and they are often getting gibbed, particularly by the bosses that, make it a case for hitting very hard, like Denathrius himself. Well, no, not really. Tanks are easily the specs and role that dies the least in a raid. They have a very low death rate compared to the other specs, almost all of the other specs. There is a couple that could match them. When we look at the tanks and we look at their death rate, this is for all of the attempts done to a boss, which includes the wipes as well. Of course, including wipes is kind of sketchy. Some bosses can be reset, some bosses can be, cheesed with maybe a teleport or a transference to reset the boss without actually causing some of the members to die. So it's gonna skew up the numbers a little bit. And you can see that Vengeance and Protection are the specs that can be more liable to dying, both protections, Warrior and Paladin, whereas Guardian and Bloodbeaker are easily the tankiest. What about if we give these specs in the hands of good players, though? What if we look at the top 25% of all tanks? Well, it doesn't change. That's more a class or more of a spec-based thing. Guardian and Blood are still the more deathless of the tanks. Now, what is interesting though, after looking at this, is that when you take away the wipes and you only look at the deaths during a kill, whether it was a smooth kill or a complete clusterfuck, or if it was a guild that was easily farming the boss, or if it was a pug, it's actually interesting to see Vengeance, Demon Hunter, being the least prone to dying tank. It's actually a pretty significant reversal when you look at the wipes compared to the kills. So it is a pretty good sign when you are trying to attempt a boss and you see your Vengeance Demon Hunter not dying, that your chances of killing the boss are pretty significantly increased. What is actually very cool about tanks, and this is why I love stats and numbers about this game, is this thing right here. I know, I don't want to embarrass you, you can't read, so I'm gonna read for you. This is the patch, the 30th of March, where Blizzard is hotfixing tanks to take 10% less damage. This was the time where the hotfixing due to the bugs of Vengeance Demon Hunter, making them take less magic damage, was being fixed. And at the same time, they also buffed 10% less damage taken for all of the other tanks. And this is how it looks. Could it be any clearer? Vengeance Demon Hunter, on the 30th of March, pretty much received barely any change, any significant change in their deaths, whereas every single other tank, which was granted with this new found tankiness, significantly dropped in their death rate. That is a very cool representation of the buff to tanks taking effect. Now, next to the tanks, we're gonna go over the healers. This is starting to get a little bit more interesting though, because first we look at all of the healers. These were the healers from all of the kills and all of the wipes in Castonatria, we are looking at some 600,000 to 700,000 logs, so the numbers are extremely vast, and the numbers are somewhat close but still significant. There is an over 30% difference between Resto Shaman and Holy Priest and Discipline Priest in terms of deaths. When you then look at the top healers, right, the top 25%, the number gets stretched even slightly further. Discipline Priest is even higher compared to Holy and Restoration, both Shaman and Druid. And to follow that up to be even greater of a gap, we can see the deaths of all healers when it comes to actually killing the boss. And here the gap is even larger. And now, no, Spirit of Redemption of Holy Priest still counts as a death. It's not that they get it for free. The only, possible cheat you might consider is the fact that Ankh, so resting yourself through Ankh, doesn't count as a death for a Resto Shaman. The logic being used here is just the same logic for combat rests. Combat resting someone costs a combat rest charge because he was dead. Using Ankh doesn't cost a combat rest because it's part of your own toolkit. It's basically a cheat death defensive. So just like you wouldn't count a death, someone proccing cheat death for a rogue, Ankh functions the same way, except it's much worse because it's got a 30 fucking minute cooldown. Still. What is more interesting, other than Restoration Shamans being very tanky, because between their 90-second cooldown reduction defensive and their 1 minute long Earth Elemental, which can give them 30% max HP, the fact that they are Necrolords, and they now get a super buffed version of Fleshcraft, 20% damage reduction on use on top of the shield, so they are very sturdy. The confusing part is about Discipline, particularly the difference between Discipline and Holy, because pretty much almost every type of critique or justification for Discipline dying so much in a raid can be applied to Holy. If Discipline is slow, so they get caught by mechanics more, the same goes for Holy. If they have no defensive, well, the same goes for Holy. As a matter of fact, Discipline has stronger shields. They have the ability to heal more with absorbs than a Holy Priest can, so technically they should be slightly tankier than a Holy Priest. Yet, somehow they die in the realm of 50 to 60 to 70% more than a Holy Priest. And I have been told that Holy Priest main players are just e-girls. They are the GFs of the main tank guild leader that gets brought into the raid while being clueless. Why are they dying so little compared to Discipline Priests? This min-maxing nerds chasing the flavor of the month. They should be the experts on this. So if they are, why do they die so much? In case people are wondering, well, that's because Discipline is more popular. Well, that's because Discipline is more played. Not really, actually, because Holy Priest is actually more popular than Discipline, mostly because many people are still playing Holy in the lower bosses. Yes, of course, there is way more Discipline Priests in the harder bosses later on, but Warcraft Logs even offers you a death counter based on the pull count of the bosses. So they are weighing deaths differently based on how difficult the boss is. So dying on Denatrius or dying on Stone Legion has a different weight than dying on Shriekwing. And Shriekwing is the boss that Holy Priests are doing, while Denatrius is the boss Discipline Priests are doing. And even with this full count weighing into place, Discipline Priests are still dying way too much compared to the other healers. Then we move over, of course, to the big bulk of your raid, which is the DPS. Now, let's start with the total aggregate. Let's look at all the deaths from all the players, so no cutoff here, as well as all the kills and all the wipes. And these are the numbers. We are talking millions of logs here, hundreds of thousands for pretty much every spec except the very, very few underplayed. And even the underplayed are in the 70 to 80 to 60,000 logs. Let's get this out of the way. The differences, again, are pretty stark and clear. 50% difference between Outlaw and Demonology at the bottom compared to the top death specs. Marksmanship, Beastmastery, Arms, Frost, Arcane. Then we start cutting off a little bit. Let's cut off into the actual good players, the top 25. No major visible difference. The 3 rogue specs are still at the bottom when it comes to deaths. You still have Demonology Warlock, which is innately tanky by itself. The main particular thing you can say is the difference between Fire Mages in deaths and Arcane and Frost Mages. Most of this is going to be attributed to something like Cauterize, essentially the fact that Fire Mage gets a cheat death. Arcane and Frost have different types of defensives compared to Cauterize, but clearly Cauterize is the strongest. What might also come into play a little bit more is that Fire Mage grants them an on-the-move Scorch, so they have even more movement and freedom of movement, so they can dodge and avoid mechanics more easily. And to top this all off, Fire Mage is the only one playing Night Fae of mages, which means they have Soul Shape. So even more movement and even more chances of actually dodging the bad stuff compared to the Frost and Arcane mages. The other difference here, and I want to, so to speak, bring the olive tree branch in favor of Hunters, because as soon as people see this, they're like, ha, I knew it. Hunters are fucking brain dead. Look at how much they are dying. Okay, hold on a second. Hunters, in this case, they are the ones who get given, basically, most of the mechanics, right? You might have experienced, for example, having to break from the raid to go do the urns, the canisters on Inerva. They have to go and do all of the mechanics of Zymox, the seeds, and in their case it's much more risky than a mage. A mage has multiple blinks, they have alter time. As mentioned, they have soul shape. Hunters are much more in danger when they have to do seeds. The same can be said for Stone Legion generals when they are assigned the soaking. Again, they are more at risk when they do that compared to a mage. So it is partially excused, the fact that hunters die more, because they are generally given more mechanics to do compared to, for example, a Shadow Priest, who is comfortably sitting in the middle, or even a Warlock. And technically speaking, Affliction Warlocks are dying a little bit too much compared to the defensive they have, their self-healing they have, compared to Hunters. So I don't think Hunters being at the top of deaths, whether you're looking at all players or the top 25% of players, or even here, if we look at only the kills. Even when we look at the kills only, you still have cleanly and clearly Hunters at the top. I am willing to cut them some slack a little bit because of the amount of mechanics they have to do. Flipping the script upside down, looking at the resilient specs. So you have the 3 rogue specs, fine. They have Cloak of Shadows, fine. They have Cheat That. For some mechanics, they can even have evasion. So generally speaking, you don't want to see any melee spec dying less than a rogue. If a rogue dies a lot, if every time you are progressing on a boss and you glance over your raid frame and you see a black or a dark gray unit frame and that's the rogue being dead, he's bad. Generally speaking, rogues should die very, very little, even more now than compared to something like Legion. That was back when you were stacking multiple rogues, making them do a bunch of different mechanics with their cheeses and their immunities, so they were sometimes more prone to dying because of it. But now, it's not even that. You know, now from BFA onwards, most of the cheesing required has been handled by mages and hunters most of the time. So rogues aren't even part of that much anymore. As we mentioned already, Demonology is very tanky, so generally speaking, you don't want to die. As a Demolock, you're very resilient. And then we have the Shamans. Again, same point as before, Shamans have Ankh, so effectively they have a free rest every once in a while. I am willing, totally not, because I am playing Shaman myself, I am willing to agree with this. Ankh is part of your toolkit, it's part of your defensives, and it doesn't interact and it doesn't obstruct any other form of battle rests. So I do think it's okay to exclude some of the deaths that happened and got rest by their own Ankh. As mentioned before, Shaman anyways is still very tanky, regardless of their Ankh. You wouldn't want to see them dying too often, regardless of whether or not they can Ankh. What surprises me in this list of deaths is, number one, the difference between Fury Warriors and Arms Warriors. Arms Warriors dying more than Fury, as well as Balance Druid. We just went over the fact that Balance Druids have been nerfed in their well-honed Instincts Conduit because it was a very powerful defensive. Balance Druid, with the whole thing about getting more armor from their Moonkin form, grants them higher innate defensiveness against physical damage. They have some talents they can take for better defensive. They have their own Barskin, they can even go, if they want to, really, they can go into the Guardian Affinity for being able to use Frenzied Region by themselves into bear form. They can still shift into bear form for the extra stamina and defensiveness, and with the aforementioned very powerful Conduit. Not to mention, just to top this all off, they do have a mini leap they can pick, you know, their Wild Charge talent, and they are Night Fae, which means they have access to Soul Shape. So I do think Balance Druids dying as much as they are. If you look at the top players, they are in the top 3 or so of most dying range specs. I still think they are a little bit high compared to the rest. So with this, we have the TLDR of the video. If you are playing a rogue, if you're playing an elemental shaman, a demonology warlock, surprisingly, if you're playing a havoc demon hunter, you should be amongst the least dying players in your own raid, whereas if you're playing hunters, if you're playing mages not called fire, if you're playing arms warrior, balance druid, even shadow priest, you are more prone to dying. Now, whether or not it is because you're making more mistakes, your entire spec as a whole, the hundreds of thousands of players playing the spec are worse collectively, or because you just have poorer defensives, I will leave this up to the community to decide. I'm pretty sure they are already set on a few of these stereotypes. So, for this death recap for the day, we are done. Congratulations and salutations if you have made it through this video. If you are still alive by the end of this, you're still welcome to subscribe to the channel. If you don't, remember I know a guy who knows a guy who can spike up your death chance by 5% by the end of the week. So, you know, just saying. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, yes, indeed, I made it through another video without mentioning survival once. Shit.